These second generation Toyota Tacomas might just be the most reliable pickup truck ever sold, or at least one of them. With that said though, if you're shopping for one, there are a few common issues that you're going to want to keep an eye out for. So I think it's safe to say that the biggest killer of these second gen Tacomas is rusty frames. They are notorious for this. Now here's the thing, like Canadian winters are hard on any vehicle, and especially provinces and states that use road salt. They'll kill any vehicle, but these Tacomas are extra susceptible to it because the coating that the factory put on them was faulty, essentially, and they rusted sort of prematurely or maybe too deeply, I guess, to the point where it became structural. There was a class action lawsuit that a bunch of Tacoma owners got together, and eventually it got Toyota's attention, and they didn't want the smoke, so they had a complete frame recall where you could bring your truck into a dealership and they'll give you a whole brand new frame, swap it on your truck free of charge. And as you can see by the stickers on my frame here, mine was one of the frames that had it done. So the downside though is that they only did it for a few years, and so if you do find a truck that would have been eligible for it but didn't get it done, well, tough noogies, you're out of luck because they ended the campaign. So unless your local dealership is feeling extra generous, you're not going to be able to get the frame recall done for free. You're going to be paying out of pocket. Another common issue with these things is the rear leaf springs breaking. And I think this is kind of a combination of a defective part that just failed, and then also the fact that these Tacomas just don't really handle payload very well. They don't really like having a whole bunch of weight in the bed, and it's very easy to overload these springs. So they did update the rear springs. I think that was a recall as well. Trucks like this that got the new frame on them also got the new suspension as well, because they typically had to chop the control arms and stuff off the front, and the rear springs were usually a problem as well. So they kind of did it all at once, I think, on a lot of them. You still can't load these things down like you can with a full-size truck or anything, and it's a little bit deceptive because especially trucks like this that have the access cab and the 6-foot bed, it looks like you can put a lot of weight in the bed, but it's a mid-sized truck. They're just not really meant to handle a really heavy amount of payload. So it's a good idea to get under it and take a look at the shape of the leaf spring and make sure that it's got that arc in it. If it's kind of flat or even like pushed up or something, that's going to be cause for concern. That's going to show that the springs are definitely weak and they can crack. There's even been cases where the one spring will break off and it can actually puncture the gas tank, which could, obviously cause some major issues. So definitely keep an eye out for that one. All right, unfortunately, we do have to get under the hood here briefly because there are a couple things to watch out for, even on these bulletproof 4-liter V6s. The earlier trucks like this one do have some issues with head gasket failures, and it was a bigger problem on the 4th generation 4Runners like mine here, the V6 version. 03 and 04, that was the biggest years for head gasket failures on this engine. And so by the time they came out with this Tacoma, it was already 2005, which is when they sort of solved the issue with the 4Runners, but it still is something to keep an eye out for. Another thing, and my poor truck here with 340K on it suffers from many of these, is oil leaks, valve cover leaks. Just, it seems like on this truck, all of the seals and gaskets are seeping or leaking, but it doesn't seem to really lose much oil, but it's definitely something to keep an eye out for. The timing chain cover is also a known leaking point on this engine as well. It is pretty labor intensive to change it though, so unless it's really bad, you're probably just going to want to leave that alone and keep an eye on your fluid levels. The U-joint in the steering shaft, apparently it's a bad design. It just develops some play. The result is you end up with a whole bunch of steering wheel slop. It's almost like the kind of play that you would find in like an old school steering box setup where you have, an inch or two of play before it actually engages the steering of the truck. So I did have that problem with this truck, and it turns out it is actually pretty common on these. Okay, this one is kind of a strange one, and it's definitely a Tacoma problem. It's very common that your fan speed stops working properly, and so you might have the low setting, and then this one is also low, this one is also low, and then high full blast, and there's nothing in between. So there should be, as you can see, 4 settings on this. And when this fails, you typically either have like wide open or just barely on, and there's nothing in between, there's no adjustment. So what happens is there's a fan speed resistor underneath here, and the harness that goes to it, the connection gets a little bit loose. I don't know if it just wiggles free with vibrations or if it's a bad design, but when it gets loose, it arcs inside there and sparks, and that can create some heat. It actually burns the connection. And it can also fry the resistors themselves, but a lot of people just replace the resistor and they keep on having to replace them, and it's actually the wiring harness that's the problem there. It's a pretty easy fix though. So moving on to the other side of the interior here, we have the four-wheel drive system. These Tacomas are just like the 4Runners in that you have to use it or lose it, and if you don't engage your four-wheel drive often, or at least once a month, it can seize up. And on these Tacomas specifically, there are a few different problems with engagement that could be the culprit if you're having trouble with it actually engaging four-wheel drive. It's very common that the ADD actuator on the front diff gets gummed up and seized, and sometimes you can take it apart and clean it up and save it. Sometimes you have to replace it. There's a few different issues that can happen with these, and so I would recommend going on the Tacoma World forums. There's a whole bunch of different threads on there that have all kinds of helpful information about all the different potential problems with these four-wheel drive systems, because again, if they haven't been engaged often, there's a good chance that they're going to be causing some trouble. And you'll know it obviously if you're stuck in two-wheel drive and you keep getting stuck in the snow, but also you'll have a flashing light in the dash if it's not engaging. If it goes on solid, that means you're fine. If it's flashing, that means that it didn't engage. And sometimes it'll even make a buzzing or a beep sound to really get your attention that something's wrong. So keep an eye out for that. If you're shopping for one of these trucks, definitely engage the four-wheel drive and make sure everything is freed up and working properly, because it can be a bit of a pain to chase whatever the cause of the problem is on these. Another issue that these trucks share with the fourth generation 4Runners is sticky front brake calipers. And again, it also doesn't help if you're living in a climate that uses a lot of road salt and stuff, because any kind of corrosion is going to make it even worse. But the pins that the pads slide on can get corroded, and they can even get to the point where the caliper itself freezes up and you have to replace the whole caliper. The good news is, unlike the 4Runner, you don't have to worry about the rear brakes on these trucks, because believe it or not, all the way up until the brand new ones in 2024, these Tacomas, every single model, every single year, had drum brakes on the back, which is a little bit embarrassing. There's a lot of people that joke about that, but the good news is drum brakes are pretty much maintenance free for the most part. So it's just the fronts that you have to keep an eye on. You can tell if they're seized by if the truck isn't tracking straight when you're driving it, if it's pulling to one side, or if the fuel economy is really bad, or a lot of times if you drive it, you can even feel the actual face of the wheel and see if it's really hot. Like be careful, don't burn yourself, but one wheel might be warmer feeling than the opposite side, and that'll really tell you that one of the brakes is sticking. This next one can be a problem with any vehicle that sits outside in the direct sunlight, and that is faded, cloudy, yellow headlights. But I feel like the Toyota trucks of this era and this generation were extra susceptible to this, because if you look at the listings online, so many of them have yellow headlights, and it just seems like it's a bit more common on these trucks. So these ones, I've actually restored these 2 times now, and what's left is actually yellow on the inside of this lens, and there's nothing you can do about that. Another issue too with these is, if you see a lot of these trucks, this section right here is yellow. It's different than the rest of the lens, but it almost looks like it was by design, but Toyota didn't design it that way. These lights were intended to be perfectly clear, and it's actually the heat of the halogen lights in here, the bulbs, that it damages the plastic from the inside out. It can cause like spiderweb cracks. It can permanently stain the inside of the lens. In this case, when they're really bad, and these were so bad you could hardly even see the lights turned on through them before I restored them. So they function now, but they still don't look great. And the only way to fix that is just to replace them. And they're pretty easy to replace on these trucks as well. One more issue that I've had with this truck, which is totally random and very strange, and also not a big deal at all, is this center console latch here. This thing failed, it broke, and the spring popped out. And so you can't actually just buy a whole new latch if you want to. I think they're pretty cheap too. I didn't want to spend the time on it, so I actually just took the spring out of a pen and put a new spring in here, and it works okay. So that's pretty much everything that you need to know about these Tacomas that you need to look out for. One final thing though is, I would definitely get a code reader. Bring a code reader with you and just make sure it doesn't have any trouble codes. Make sure that there's no check engine lights on in the dash or anything. Just scan it real quick and just see what comes up. But aside from that, these trucks are very solid, and realistically, if you find one that has a good frame on it, then buy it, because that's exactly what this truck is. And all of the parts, all the body parts are so easy to swap on these things. I've swapped the bedside, the fender, the bumpers. It's no big deal. So if you get one with a good frame, then you've got a good truck regardless of the mileage. So one more thing to remember, guys, is that even the worst Tacoma is more than likely still more reliable than any other pickup truck. So good luck shopping, and I hope this video helped you guys out.